Welcome to the Happy Pear podcast, where our ultimate goal is to inspire, educate, and awaken your curiosity, and overall to help you to become healthier and happier.
We're Dave and Steve, identical twins who started a veg shop nearly 20 years ago. Since then, it's expanded into a social following of over 1.5 million people, nearly 50 million views of our videos, nearly 500,000 books sold, cafes, farms, apps, courses, food products to help you to eat more veg.
We speak to thought leaders, health experts, trailblazers, and specialists of all kinds, from the ones you know to those you've never ever heard of. This week's podcast is sponsored by Vivo Barefoot shoes. We've been wearing them for 6 years, and genuinely, they are our favourite shoes, and that is all we wear beyond being barefoot.
Yeah, they're really, really great. They have tons of different varieties. You get 15% off with the code HAPPYPEAR15.
And if you don't like them, what do you do, Dave?
You can send them back within 100 days. No risk. Amazing, isn't it? Yeah. So if you're interested, vivobarefoot.com, and the code is HAPPYPEAR15. I'd love to jump into like entrepreneurship, because that's probably the way that we've kind of come across you and known about you, is really your journey into using entrepreneurship to kind of, you know, as a means of evolving your own evolution.
Economic freedom.
Economic
so you can
freedom.
Pursue the freedom with which you want to explore, in essence. And we had a great chat in the sauna there yesterday, and you were talking about how in your late teens, early 20s, you were depressed. I wonder, can we go back there and start from there? That you were depressed in that you grew up in this, I'll allow you talk, sorry.
I grew up in a very religious household, which was also a spiritual household. So there was I'd say like mystical experiences. Some people's religious upbringing is very boring, you know? And, but I chucked it all once I went to university.
When you said mystical experience, now that drew me in there again.
Yeah.
Like, is that people having like, you know, I think a mystical experience, they're kind of almost like awakenings or realizations or enlightenment type
healings,
moments or Ouija boards, you know, any of that kind of stuff.
So every religion has a mystical tradition within it, whether it's Islam and Sufism or whatever, and Christianity has different sects of religions that are more or less mystical. And so in that branch, you're feeling the unconditional love of God or Jesus or whatever. That's a very kind of common one. So yes, it was a confusing upbringing, because there were these legitimate spiritual experiences of the fundamental nature of the universe, of oneness and unconditional love and all this, but mixed with a lot of dogma that I came to believe was really not true. And so humans aren't very good at isolating a bug in the program or an error in the mind and just getting rid of that one error. We tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I chucked the whole thing and then ended up a nihilist, somebody who didn't believe in any kind of meaning whatsoever.
This is your early 20s or late teens?
It must have been 21. And so I literally believed that evolution was nothing but blind, random chance, and that, you know, it made a lot of mistakes. If you listen to the traditional story of evolution, there's just a lot of defects, a lot of mutations, and some of them are great, most of them are terrible. You think of most mutations, they're awful. And humans were the one creature that had accidentally mutated to have an intelligence just above the threshold at which it could contemplate the meaninglessness of its existence. And all of the animals were just below that threshold, so they didn't realize how pointless their life was. And this was just a terrible mistake that evolution had made. And
That's a dark place. That's
a dark place.
Dark.
But I had this love of truth, and so I wanted to know what was true, no matter how painful it was. And if the truth was that there was no point to existence, I wanted to be the one non-delusional person who would embrace that truth, even though that truth was killing me.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how'd you go from there? How'd you find some meaning in that? The meaning in that was no meaning.
At first, I thought the meaning was to go around and free other people of the delusion of meaning. I could find wherever they got their meaning from, whether it was religion or having children or a career or safety or security or whatever. I could find the underpinnings of it, and I could smash them. And I thought this was like liberating them to understand the truth of meaninglessness, and they would get super depressed and it would really ruin their life. And so I was like, well, this is just aesthetically, there's no morals at this point. There's no morality. So this isn't wrong per se, but aesthetically it's ugly. Like this person was happier before they met me and now they're depressed, right? So I was just like, well, I can't do that anymore. So then I really had nothing to do. And I just laid in bed for a year and
properly in bed.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't pee myself, it's but you're really lying to me. Like there's no point in doing anything, but I would be quite uncomfortable if I just, pee myself in bed. So I will go to the restroom. But aside from basic bodily comforts, there's no point to any of this. And I had destroyed my grades in college. I'd gone in just vibrant and full of life and wanting to study computers and science and having written a lot of essays on religion and morality and ethics. I'd had a very active mind, and now I was really listless. And
it's a nice word.
Yeah,
listless.
And I told you guys the story of coming out of that. But essentially, over a 3-day period, right before I was put on antidepressants, I had a new kind of realization about that I'd made a mistake, that I had prematurely judged life as meaningless at the ripe age of 21. And I should really wait until the end of my life to make that determination. Yeah.
Wow,
I told you guys a longer story earlier.
Yeah, but it was great because like how you phrased it was, and I'd love to hear this. There was 3 nuggets. It was almost like a bit like what's like the Christmas Carol, the ghost. There was 3 kind of
riddles to crack. Yeah,
there was 3 nuggets, like, and it wasn't necessarily a ghost, to Christmas future or past, but it was 3 kind of pieces of wisdom,
learnings. But it's almost like, I imagine in the moment they weren't like, I now have 3 pillars with which to live my life. I'm sure retrospectively you could appoint that wisdom upon it, but in the moment there were probably 3 sentiments.
In the moment, I was each one was a sentence, which in epistemology we would call a proposition, a statement that may or may not be true. And I was not pleased to see them either, because they were couched in religious language. They were all verses from the Bible or the Torah or what have you. So I really didn't like that these were in my head. It's hard not to like tell the full story, but I passed all these tests at the university psychology center, and 2 or 3 different therapists, they all said you're clinically depressed, whatever that is. And I was cleared for medication. A lot of my friends were on medication, especially the really kind of intellectual ones. And the final psychiatrist who was to dispense the medication, I sat down in his office and he said something that nobody had said to me any time in the previous year. He said, "Why are you depressed?" It's a very simple question. Nobody had asked that. Everybody treated it as like catching the flu. Nobody says, "Why do you have the flu?" They go, "Oh, you have the flu," right? Nobody says, "Why do you have the flu?" So nobody said to me, "Why were you depressed?" And I told him about the meaninglessness of life, exactly what I told you guys. And the first thing I noticed was that it did not faze him at all. Whereas all these other people, it had really shaken them when I really found the foundations of their meaning. This guy he just wasn't buying it. He wasn't buying my assertions. And he said, "So you want me to put you on medication just because you're an intellectual?" And I was like, "I guess so. I mean, half the intellectuals I've been studying in school kill themselves, these famous writers and so on. So I guess this is how it goes. You get really smart and then you realize this is pointless and you get medicated. This is what it's like to be a human animal." And I told you this before, but he said, "My concern about putting you on the medication is that you're engaged in a process and the drugs will slow it down."
Wow. What awareness.
And I've told this story hundreds of times, and people look back at me and they go, "That's not what my psychiatrist said. They wrote the prescription."
Wow.
So
did that feel freeing, or did that feel like he's denying me of what I need?
It was very frustrating.
Yeah.
Because it had taken so much for me to even drag myself there to get help, sort of. And I felt like it was kind of like admitting defeat to even go and need these substances. So I really felt like I had finally dragged myself to this place to get this magic pill, and this guy was, for some bizarre reason, like denying it to me, even though they hand this stuff out like candy. I didn't quite understand. So I was very unsatisfied. And he said, "I have a suggestion. Go home and pay attention to your thoughts for 3 days. And if you still want the medication at the end of those 3 days, come back."
Jeez, it's almost like a wizard or something. It's almost like
know,
it really is.
I went back to see him a month later and he was gone.
Yeah, exactly. No record of this guy working here or anything. It half feels like that.
Did he tell you to go up a mountain and pitch a tent there and stay there for 3 days?
No, he just said, try not to distract yourself from what's there, like you've been doing. And I hadn't gone into drinking or alcohol, but I had gone into food as my escape. I was literally trying to stay in a food coma for that year. I would overeat huge quantities of garbage, and I would get sleepy, and it would help me go to sleep because consciousness was painful. And this is kind of the roots problem that many people have when they go into substance abuse of any kind. It's that their experience of consciousness is uncomfortable. Their baseline experience is uncomfortable. Yeah.
Wow. And then what happened then? How did you, what were your 3 nuggets that you...
Yeah, so I went home and I just got out a blank computer file and I just looked at it. Well, something happened before that, which was I left the counseling center. I got in my car, really confused and unsatisfied, and then I spontaneously burst into tears. And I started sobbing and crying and snotting everywhere and laughing at the same time and crying, because when you're depressed, you're really suppressing a lot of emotion. And weirdly, it's like all the emotion I hadn't felt for a year suddenly came exploding out of me. And so as somebody who cares about, and it lasts about five minutes, this episode in my car, and then I had no explanation for what had happened. And as a seeker of truth, as somebody who's very philosophically minded, I now couldn't deny that I had a new data point that I had to make sense of, which was this experience I just had. And looking back, what that experience was that he had shaken my belief in the meaninglessness of life by his response, by his not seeming to buy it, by his not being affected by what I was saying, and by his assertion that not only was life meaningful, but even my experience of depression was itself a meaningful process. He was seriously contradicting my worldview.
Without actually directly challenging you.
Exactly. But it did something to my psyche because it loosened my grip and it allowed all that emotion to come back. So I was intrigued, right? And so I went home.
And how do you like being a different perspective? Like when you release that amount of emotion, pent-up emotion, you're going to feel lighter and freer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So that convinced me to go home and do the exercise he had said. And that's when I realized that there was essentially one incessant thought only in my mind. And that was, man shall not live by bread alone. And I was not happy to see that. I never wanted to hear or think about religion ever again. And that there's this one thought in my brain is a religious verse was very unsettling. And yeah, the full verse, depending on the translation, is man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And so I'm just it's like turning this riddle over in my mind all day. Why this sentence in my mind? And as I cracked the code on it or decoded it for myself, it meant that you need more than materialism and a meaningless physics guiding your life. You need spirit, you need meaning, you need purpose. And so that sentence, you cannot live on bread alone, it's like it's saying that's an inadequate diet for your being, for your life force. You need more than that. You need more than just bread.
You're more than a physical creature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And beautiful. So I was just like, oh, that's interesting. Okay. Not buying it. I wasn't ready to, because I felt really burned by religion. I felt that I had my head pumped full of lies for, 18, 20 years of my life. And so I was not like I wasn't going to fold that easily, but it was an interesting, proposition. And then I woke up the next day and there was another incessant phrase in the mind, and that was, you'll know a tree by the fruit it bears. And as I decoded this one, I saw that it was a pragmatic statement. And so in philosophy and epistemology, pragmatism is an actual epistemological tool. And that
pragmatism, as in like how I understand pragmatism, is like practicality. Like,
yeah, how well a thing, pragmatism says that how well a thing works is some indicator of how much truth is in it, or whether there's any truth in it. So if you, if you just feel better after you have gratitude for your meal before you eat it, we don't know what's happening. Is having gratitude for your food raising the vibration of it? Is it making the molecules happy? Are they singing? Who knows? But if you say to yourself, look, I don't know what the mechanism is here, but I feel so much better if I take a few seconds before my meal to really have gratitude for it. That's pragmatism. It's saying, I'm not going to make a claim of what the actual mechanism is, but something's going on here that's positive. I'm noticing that effect.
yeah, same way like jumping in the sea in the morning. I don't know exactly what's going on, but it makes me feel a hell of a lot better.
Exactly. Yeah. That's pragmatism. And so this you'll know a tree by the fruit it bears was a, 4,000-year-old pragmatic philosophical statement. And that's what I started to realize later on, was that religious books like the Bible, they're not just full of completely authoritarian myths. They're also just full of like really pragmatic philosophical wisdom that's sometimes taken out of context and made to be religion, when really it's just like really wise philosophies in there. And so this one was saying that if you want to know if something's good or not in your life, look at the effect it's having on your life. And what's so powerful about that is that I was really in need of a way of telling the truthfulness of things in courses of action that were non-authoritarian. I was never again going to do something because a preacher said so, or a book said so, or somebody said I told you so, or I'm an authority or an expert. I needed a tool by which I could navigate reality for myself without relying on other people. And that's what this was saying. It was saying that this is a tool you can use to navigate reality. So, if you start saying, I'm going to drink 5 beers a day, from now on, and you look at your life a month later and you're sick and you're getting fat and your relationships are crap, like it's just not bearing good fruit in your life. You don't need to read, a study that tells you what the molecules are doing. It's just not bearing good fruit.
Yeah, good analogy.
So that was an interesting one. And the implication though in my situation was that this whole philosophy of meaninglessness, of nihilism, was bearing terrible fruit in my life, right? All the fruit was rotting. I'd been inquisitive and energetic when I'd gotten to school. And as soon as I got a hold of this idea of meaninglessness, it was really wrecking me. So that's what this statement was saying. It's like saying, hey, buddy, bad fruit.
Yeah, good one.
So
the riddle master's doing well.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And that's a whole other question. What is this force giving this? Is it my own subconscious? Is it something else?
Where's it coming from?
Yeah, where's it coming from? And then the third day, the statement that was incessantly there was, you'll know truth and it will set you free. And I'd heard that many, many times growing up. It's almost a cliche in Christianity. But if you really look at it, again, it's an epistemological statement. And epistemology is the formal study of truth and knowledge. And so this statement is saying, as you attain truth, there is a freeing effect that it has on your being. And so that's a really strong assertion. And so it's almost saying that the fundamental nature of reality is such that truth is a thing and a good thing. And it's how reality works on truthfulness. And the logical inverse of that, the negation of that would be, if you come to believe in falsehood, it will enslave you, right? And so the way I'd been lying in bed for a year, I might as well have been chained to that bed. I might as well have been under house arrest, right? I was in bondage to something. And so one of the last thoughts I had before everything changed was, wow, does that mean that I got a hold of something untrue? Is it possible that this nihilism, this meaninglessness, this philosophy is untrue. And that's why it's leading to this enslaving effect in my life. And so that was the last one. And once I had all three of those, kind of like these three jewels in my hand for consideration, as I remember it, the last thought I had was, interesting. And then I guess the age of 21 is a very early, if not premature age to decide that all of life is meaningless. Why don't I withhold that judgment until I get to the end of my life? And with that thought, I just let my grip relax on this.
Was there another like physical response, as in like emotional?
Oh, good point. And like in the car, all the energy and emotion came flowing back into my system, and even my visual field, everything became hypercolor.
It's like you got turned on again.
And this is even a phenomena in therapeutic modalities where they work with serious trauma victims and so on, that when they do a kind of healing in the mind that helps a person process the trauma, they'll say it's as if the color had left reality. It had all gone black and white. They couldn't really tell that it had gone black and white until the color came back. So this is a widely reported like visual phenomenon.
And suddenly you're just like, boom,
Like
full
back in-
saturation noise. You're just like,
Exactly.
Like emerging from underwater back up above the surface and that.
And if you look at it, like, hey, this fruit is amazing now, right? Now I'm feeling amazing. I can see amazingly. You know, it's just like it's the feedback mechanism is already working, right? And so I felt like with these axioms, I now had a compass, and I didn't need to believe in experts or authorities or religious figures anymore. I could just navigate reality autonomously.
very empowering.
It sounds incredibly empowering. It sounds almost like there is almost like a rebirth to a degree, where there's this, and it almost feels like your perspective then is like, well, life is finite. Like there's nothing to be afraid of. I'm going to go forth. And well, it's easy now, me looking back at what you've accomplished in the last, since you were 21, now being 43, you've gone, wow, you've made a mark, you've made a dint already. Did you certainly feel like you were free and you were in your power, like after that, and you were less afraid?
Yes. I remember I had a girlfriend at the time, and I just called her up and I was like, it's over. I'm done. She's like, done with what? You're going to kill yourself? And I'm like, no, I'm done being depressed. Like it's gone. And all that creativity came back. I had a natural drive to, since I was young, to start little businesses and into there was a hunger there.
You were a trader. You were a hustler.
A hustler, yeah. And all that came back, and yeah, I started working on the company that would essentially.
Well, I think I remember you saying you had 3 companies at the end of college. You had 3 hustles going. And you picked the winner, you picked the leader, and it was like, right, I'm all in on
pick the best horse.
Yeah, I spent the next 2 years in university starting 3 different companies, figuring out which one I was really going to pursue after graduation.
And they were all kind of computer tech based companies.
Oh yeah. Because thankfully I was a super nerd. I didn't know there was any money in computers. I just was super introverted, too shy to talk to girls, and loved fixing computers and programming. And then lo and behold, it turned out there was money in it.
And you were drawn to computers, just as an aside, was largely you were good at maths. It was quite nerdy, and it was something a world where you could control.
And even before that, though, as a child, like I grew up in a fairly poor family, and there were 2 things I loved. I loved technology and I loved nature, and I loved them equally. But what I remember is, even being a child, my parents would throw away an electronic, or I'd see a broken television or a broken radio at the curbside or in somebody's trash, and I would get it out, and I would take screwdrivers and I would crack this thing open, and I would just stare at the circuit board. Even as an 8-year-old, having no idea. Like, my parents are not engineers; they couldn't tell me a thing about it. I would just stare at the circuit board, and I would look at all these colorful pieces that I didn't even know at the time what a capacitor was, or a resistor, or any of these things. And it's like a UFO had landed in the backyard. That's how fascinating it was to me. So that was there since childhood.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you, and just because now I know, your company, you were way ahead of your time. Like, broadband hadn't come out. There was talk of broadband is going to change the world. How we interact with the internet is going to drastically evolved.
This is obviously the early 2000s.
And your company was largely focused on GPS and transport.
I loved computers even before they talked to each other. I mean, just that's how you know you're a real nerd. There was nothing. They were frustrating. They didn't work very well. They were very
there wasn't,
limited.
so just to give a context, there wasn't a sex appeal. Nowadays, computers, there's Apple, they've changed life fundamentally in the last 2 decades. Like, you know, and there's superheroes like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, and these are, you know, tech, computer based, like they're the rock stars of our age to an extent.
And there's infinite uses to them nowadays.
Right.
But back then, the use was like, it
was a weird hobby.
calculator.
It was a weird hobby.
Yeah. So
you could go around and people say, what are you into? Do you like sports or this, that? And you could say, I'm into computers. And it was like, oh, weird. That was like saying I'm into like shuffleboarding or something.
Or comic books.
Like, yeah, comic books. They're like, oh, okay, that's a funny thing to be into. Yeah. And then little by little, I noticed though, like I was working, I did some construction for my uncle just to make some money. And I was getting paid like $5 an hour to do roofing jobs where I was literally like 30, 40 feet above the ground, truly risking my life, almost dying, hauling 80-pound bags of shingles up ladders. And I'd get home at the end of the day with, you know, $30 in my pocket. And then my mom would say, hey, Mrs. So-and-so wants you to take a look at her computer. Would you take a look at it? And I say, yeah, sure. And I go over there and I fix this nice old lady's computer while she gave me a sandwich and a glass of lemonade and $50. And I walk out of there and I was just like, wait a minute. You know, but it took those experiences to be like, wait, there's money in this thing, you know?
Computers is way easier.
A glass of lemonade and a sandwich versus an 80-kilo bag of shingles or whatever.
Yeah. And then before the internet, you could dial into another person's computer and play like a video game against each other using your phone line. Right? So you would just put in their phone number. It would connect to them. It was incredible because the latency was actually quite low. Although most people only had one phone line, so your parents would always pick up the phone and try to call their friends or whatever, and the modem would be going, and then it would ruin your game, and you're like, no, Mom. But that moment that a friend showed up in a virtual world, even though there were just two of us, and we chase each other around with shotguns or whatever.
This is 20 years ago.
Exactly, but you could see where it was going. You were just like, oh, I know where this is going, you know.
And then your company was GPS.
Yeah.
With transport, which was way ahead of its time.
Yeah, like, exactly. So in 2002 or whatever, immediately after coming out of this depression, my mind is just like, and I'm waiting for the bus at school, and I'm like, where the hell is this thing? I've been waiting for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Sometimes it was a holiday and it was never coming. I just wasn't getting the memo. And I go back and play video games now that we're networked on the internet. And there'd be these virtual worlds where there'd be 20 of us chasing each other around a virtual world, throwing grenades at each other, Jeeps flipping over, really phenomenal technology for the day. And then I'd run out to the bus stop and say, where the hell is this thing? I have no clue where this thing is. And I just started to notice that there were incredible disparities of the distribution of technology, that so much of it was being pointed at entertainment and video games and things like this. And there were whole massive industries that were completely technologically illiterate, and there just wasn't anybody who was good with technology wanting to go to some boring industry. So it didn't take me long to realize why can I chase my friends around for this frivolous activity with all this technology, and we don't know where this $1 million piece of public infrastructure is. And so I was just
a bus.
And so I was just like, I think I can solve this. And so literally had to buy GPS receivers and wire them into.
And this is just your own little harebrained idea. I got it. I can solve it. There was this self agency.
And was it entrepreneurial based at the time? Was it kind of going, I can make a bit of coin out of this?
Yeah. By this point, I'd finally encountered an entrepreneur, and this sounds funny, but until I was 22, I didn't know what an entrepreneur was. I really thought...
it wasn't really a word. Like nowadays it's like rock star, but back even when we studied business, it wasn't really a common term.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And even going to the business school, like I tried to take a couple classes in the business school, and they were just prepping you to be a consultant or something. So even entrepreneurship wasn't a thing in even the business side of campus, right? And it certainly wasn't a thing on the technology and engineering side of campus. But one day I finally met an entrepreneur. They brought him in to give a talk. And it just suddenly, my whole life made sense. This guy, he wasn't a super genius. He just had an idea. He saw an inefficiency and he just decided to solve it. and every day woke up and worked on it until they had customers and blah, blah, blah. And it was the simplest thing I'd ever heard. And I almost leapt out of my seat because my head was full of ideas for solutions, but I couldn't figure out what course to take in school to teach me about what to do with it. And I was just like, no, you just do it. You just build the thing and then you ask people to buy it. Like, it's that simple. And I just couldn't believe that it had never really been shown to me that way. So I knew at this point that entrepreneurship was the way for me. The way, just like electricity shot through my body when I realized you could really bust the ceiling that was there in all these other jobs. And I was already working at IBM for like a year at this point. And so I saw what a big company is like on the inside and how
the inefficiencies and middle management.
And some people, you know, this is where personalities come in. Some people feel really secure in a big company. And I felt the opposite. The fact that I couldn't decide where the company was going and had no say in the direction of the product or anything felt very uncertain to me.
Or disempowering, in a
very
sense.
Disempowering, yeah.
So then you saw the bus, and like, you know, the expensive bus, and suddenly the lack of technology, and you went, right.
Yeah, and I essentially had to get a GPS fix, a coordinate off of the bus, and send it to the internet, and then send that to people's computers and phones. And there weren't even smartphones yet. So it was non-trivial. This was like, if you wanted to develop an app for a flip phone, there was no app store to go to. And I remember, you know, calling Motorola or whatever, and they treated me like a hacker. Why do you want, you know, the API or the code base or, you know, the SDK, it would have been called at the time, to program this phone? Like, what department do you work for at Motorola? I mean, I don't work for a department at Motorola. I want to write an app for your phone. It was like, it wasn't even a concept to them, right?
Wow.
And then the other issue was that GPS had been a military technology. So the only thing the public knew about GPS, if you said GPS, they imagined some scene out of
James Bond
the Iraqi conflict or whatever, right? Where there's a missile like being guided into a terrorist bunker. That's what people knew about GPS, was that we had missiles now.
So it was scary. It was associated with war.
So when I went to transit agencies and said, guess what? I'm going to put GPS onto your buses. We're going to show everybody where they are, and then people will be happier. And you won't need so many buses because you'll actually know where your buses are. And they literally at times said to me, what about terrorists? Like, could terrorists blow up our bus now that there's a GPS? I'm not kidding you. This is how, and I would say to them, well, listen, if your bus ran on time, the terrorists would just wait at the bus stop and blow it up anyway. You see, there's not really a thing here, you know, but it was just, half my practice was just figuring out how not to insult these people whenever I went in there, you know? And then the other thing they said is, we don't want the public to see where these buses are. They'll see that the whole thing runs like crap. You know, the buses are all, we tell them that they're all spaced out and coming on time. And what you're going to see is that they're all bunched up and they're, you know. And I was like, yeah, but okay, here's the deal then. Why don't we just show you where they are? And then once you're comfortable and get the system running much better, then consider showing the public where they are. And they eventually went for it.
And was that a hard process? Because, like, we know ourselves, once you develop something, what you charge for it is kind of,
and how you
know,
sell
when
it.
you're going.
One thing having a great idea, it's another thing to sell.
But then when you're going into these companies and going, hey, I've developed this idea, it's going to cost you, I don't know, you've got to make up a number, $2, $200, $2,000, $200,000, you know.
To do what I wanted to do, the way I wanted to do it, I had to charge 10 times more than they had ever paid for anything in this category. So their vehicle tracking was just becoming a thing where you could get a location from like the plumber or the electrical, you know, technician's van, you know, like 2 or 3 times a day. You could get one little update. And so nobody had done it in real time, and nobody had done it so that you could actually see things move. And I was coming to them saying, it's going to be just like a video game. You're going to see this bus driving down the street and slowing down and turning. And so we had to push all the technology harder than it had ever been pushed before. Wireless data was hardly being used. There was just mostly SMS. Web browsers weren't good at making things move inside of them yet. It was all static web pages. So we really had to push the limits of every technology.
Good job.
But somehow all the stars aligned.
The somehow is the super hard work.
Okay, so it certainly didn't happen by itself.
No. And also, so there was a technological innovation that needed to happen. And then there was also a business model innovation that needed to happen. So I needed to convince these people that it was worth paying 10 times more for. So I invented a category. I called it transit visualization systems, right? So if you're in like, this is like a little business lesson, but if you need to justify a higher price point than has ever been paid for your category, you need to invent a new category so that people stop thinking about the comparison.
Comparing, okay.
So they're like, oh, that's how much a transit visualization system would cost, because it never existed before. So that was the innovation.
That was
there.
clever.
Yeah.
Wow. And so anyway, you built this company. Like the highlights are obviously the fact that you're here talking about it is you ended up selling it. You did well out of it. And that was like a chapter in your life.
Yeah, and it's...
What age were you when you sold it? Because suddenly you went from being this nerd who...
A 21-year-old
who buried his head into a business and built a business and made a lot of money, and suddenly you were financially free, and suddenly you were like... I imagine there was existential crisis about that.
But what age was his first question?
Yeah. It's you know how you tell these stories in a simplified way so they don't get complicated. So let's just say I sold it much later, but I achieved financial independence much earlier. Yeah. As a business, it was just working well, and I didn't sell it until 14 years later, actually. But I had all the financial independence that a single person could need long before that, and it's almost comedic looking back because people told me this was a bad idea when I was pitching it. Everything from, if this was a good idea, somebody would already be doing it, right? That's like the kryptonite of entrepreneurship, right? If that's such a good idea, why aren't somebody doing it, right? I don't know. People are
busy in other ways.
They're doing something else. They don't want to take the risk. Whatever the answer is to that question, it's a really dumb statement. And there were so many days where I was on the verge of being demoralized because it was difficult to get a company off the ground with very little financing, my own personal savings, and no track record, no pedigree. Yeah, I guess I had a computer science degree, but I literally would look in the mirror some nights after a hard day where people had told me this is not a good idea, and I would look in the mirror and I would say, okay, Josh, what do we know? Right now, nobody knows where the bus is. Not the people riding the bus, not the people running the bus. And with your idea, if you make that happen, people would know where the bus was. And that's got to be better, right? It's got to be better to know where it is instead of not know where it is. I'd have to give myself this, like, what we now call a first principles pep talk. First principles, right? Because the naysayers, will get into your brain.
They were loud, yeah, of course. And it's almost like the payout comes because you persevere through absolute hardship and you lonely go through the woods. It's like that expression, like life will reward you only after it's trialed you, or
you'd only get treasure after trials.
Trials, and it's like you went through some serious trials to get that.
Serious trials and hilarious learnings looking back. Now that you don't feel the pain after enough time has passed, right? But I remember talking to an advisor when I just was really struggling to sell this thing to anybody, right? And he said, "What's the price point?" And I was like, "Well, like." For this size fleet, it'd be like $300,000 up front, and then $150,000 a year recurring revenue. That's the model I've come up with. I think it makes sense because of how much money they're saving. And he goes, "And what happens when you meet with them, with these customers, potential customers?" And I said, "Oh, I'm not meeting with anybody. I'm just like emailing them." And he just falls out of his chair and he goes, "You can't sell a kid." Your age can't sell something for $300,000 over the phone. They need to see you in their office and know that you're a real person for that size money, for that size check." And I was just like, and I was such an introvert, right? I was like, the last thing I wanted to hear, but it was like undeniably true. I was like, oh, that makes sense.
That seems so obvious. Like
I don't want to hear that.
I don't want to talk to people. I don't like people. I like computers. I like code.
I was a nerd. I was like, look, you're going to know where your freaking buses are. What more do I need to tell you? Like, it's going to be great, And so I had to like book a plane ticket and a train ticket. And I just started traveling around and saying the same thing I'd already told them over the phone in person. And then I remember a deal closed on a Thursday, a Friday, and a Monday.
And you
and that was it. That was it. You knew.
Ka-chink, ka-chink,
This is like in the movie. This is the part where the music takes a different beat, and it's like, yes, it's happening. We've just gone through the dark night. Like it's woohoo.
Exactly. And then the other funny thing was, again, there's so many hilarious learning experiences in entrepreneurship that you really can't get in a big company where you don't have that kind of autonomy. So after these 3 deals closed, I told my little team, and I was like, this is amazing. And they're just like, we don't have the money to buy that equipment to front these deals. And I was like, oh, we don't, do we? And I was just like, crap, we should have put in that contract that there's a down payment or something, you know? And it was not in there because it was just like a thing I wrote. It was like a little contract I wrote, you know? So I had to call back each one of them and say, you know, due to unexpected demand for our product, there's a slight chance that the project schedule we talked about could slip unless you're able to put an advance down so that we can keep to the scheduled timeline, right? I would put it very diplomatically. And each one of them said, okay, that makes sense. And they each mailed a $30,000 check. And I just remember getting off the phone, and I'm just like, this is entrepreneurship. Like, you just think of a possibility and nobody can tell you whether it's going to be wrong or right. You have to see what reality says about it. And you're really uncapped at this point, you know? And so that's a thrill you can't really get any other way.
I want to go rogue here because I want to go into the mechanics behind this, because everyone listening is kind of going, amazing story, the story of entrepreneurship. But there's deeper meanings here, and we got into this when we were chatting in the sauna yesterday about the reality of, like, you know, all of us, you know, most of us live in a reality where, you know, there's money, we have jobs, we have rent or mortgages or families or not families, and we kind of have these constraints and whatnot. And your experience was consistently, you were meeting barriers, you were meeting obstacles, and you had to keep reimagining things. And we were discussing yesterday the idea of focus and the idea of kind of creation and co-creation and manifesting. And we kind of went into, like, those are kind of buzzwords or whatever, but the reality is kind of bringing into life what you really desire and the capacity to do that. And obviously you had a very unique experience at 21, you know, that kind of almost like it is like a transformational experience. And maybe that kind of wired you differently or whatnot, but you certainly have a very unique perspective on reality and bringing things into reality. And I think that's part of the gifts of an entrepreneur, an artist, any kind of creative person. And I'd love to delve into this because this is relevant to everyone listening. Everyone listening goes, I have dreams. How do I turn my dreams into goals? How do I turn these goals into reality?
Yeah. There's one important thing you said, which is that there was a benefit to having and emerging from the dark night of the soul at an early age, because manifesting something, creating something that doesn't exist, that's an act of will. It's a slog at times. But I already knew what it was like to have no purpose and to think of killing myself. So it was certainly better than that. I was undergirded now by this curiosity about life and human potential and wanting that freedom that comes from financial independence, not because I loved money itself, but because I loved the idea of having freedom to pursue my interests. So all that was there, and I appreciated that. And if I hadn't gone through that existential crisis, I don't know that those objects, those things would have been as attractive to me to pull me through. Yeah.
Good distinction.
Yeah.
Nice one. And even on that topic of, like, you know, do you have any guiding principles or any kind of, you know, I'd love to understand if you could articulate your view on creating, manifesting, whatever it is, you know, achieving things which we want to achieve and bringing them into reality beyond, like, you know, many of us have come across these books, The Secret, you know, this word manifesting, it can be a bit woo-woo. Yeah. People like it or hate it. Yeah. It's a bit binary. But ultimately, most of us have these things which we want to achieve. Yeah. And they could be financial goals. They could be having a house. They could be getting a partner, whatever it might be. And discussing with you over the last 2 days, it's been like, yeah, you've got a really unique perspective on reality. And, you know, we were even discussing yesterday, you were saying like, I don't know what box I fit in. Like you said, like Simon Sinek is the why guy. I think I'm more like the what guy. And it was like, because you're like, you know, you're into the
Start
reality.
with what? What the hell is going on down here? That's my...
Yeah, the reality of life, like the nature of reality of life, which sounds crazy, but like anyone who's listening goes, this guy's really philosophical and super smart. Like you really, really are. And your unique view, your operating system is different to most people. Yeah. And that's what I've observed over the last 24 hours. And I'd love if you could kind of even uncover a little bit of that and leave a few breadcrumbs for us people. Yeah.
And what's funny is I can say the same thing in multiple languages, so I can put it in manifesting terms. So first I'll say it like in manifesty language.
Okay.
Woo-woo.
And then
go woo-woo.
California speak or New Age
go
speak.
California and then go like, you know, I'm not into woo.
And then I'll say the same thing in a
science
technological.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Right. Lovely.
So the name of the game for manifesting is alignment. That's the name of the game.
We live in a universe of resonance and vibration.
Alignment meaning your thoughts, your actions, your beliefs are all in harmony.
Yeah, yourself, and those are all words that point at aspects of yourself, right? So the more of these trillion cells and the impulses they're creating and the synapses that are firing, I'm already getting into sciencey speak, but the more of those that can work together harmoniously in a single direction, the more in alignment you are.
So the more focus, like an arrow with less resistance, you are just...
Exactly. And that means maybe there's something a little more mystical going on, or law of attraction kind of stuff, resonance. You know, Nikola Tesla said that the universe works on a principle of resonance. So you can think about it at that level. But even if your brain structure and all of your little neural nets and subnets that make up your brain, if they're all on board with the thing you're trying to achieve, then you're going to be walking down the street and you're going to hear out of the corner of your ear somebody say something super relevant, and you'll stop and go, "Did you just say blah blah blah?" And you'll start, these opportunities will start showing up because more of your hardware is aligned with where you're going. Now, if instead half your brain is full of self-doubt or criticism or who am I or not good enough,
or what about, say, half your brain is fit up with like, you know, I'm totally on board, I'm laser focused, I'm all about it. However, I've got a very busy family life. I've got so many other responsibilities that my head needs multiple, you know, like you, certainly in your entrepreneurial journey, you didn't have a busy family life. You know, you could go all in on this one
That's
thing.
Right.
How do you manage juggling, or is there any, like, obviously if you've got multiple things, it's probably going to dilute your capacity to focus like an arrow.
I had to quit my job at IBM because I knew I couldn't do what I needed to do in my spare time. So the people who manage to do things with kids or another job or whatever, you have to ask them. You have to have them on the show and ask them. The path I took was minimalism and like the path of a samurai, right?
No plan B.
No plan B, burn the boats. And also I'm going to do this as a broke recent graduate who is not putting in job applications anywhere. And I even went dumpster diving and volunteered at a food shelter where they let me take the rottiest food at the end of the weekend that nobody wanted, that even the poorest families didn't even want, right? And I would take so my lifestyle was going from crappy to crappy. It wasn't a big jump.
But you didn't care. You were fighting your fight.
That's what alignment looks like. I'm happy going dumpster diving because I know that I don't have to be down at IBM anymore where my mind is being distracted to their projects instead.
So you were, you know, the way you'll often give this analogy, Steve, of there's three people, you know, lifting blocks, you know, and one person is lifting blocks because they're told to lift a block. The second person is lifting block because they're, you know, they're getting paid for it. And
they're building a wall.
And the third person is lifting block because they're building a cathedral, the best cathedral you could ever have. And they're all doing the same function, but through how they're looking at it, their attitude, the experience is very different.
Exactly. And so the wall I'm building is self-actualization, enlightenment, the freedom to pursue the questions of the universe.
Creation.
Yeah. So that's what's driving me.
Okay, so you described it in woo-woo language. Can you give it to us in science language or in more technological language?
In a little bit, but let's go with the the
alignment
brain.
in technology speak.
Yeah. So the it's more like neuroscience speak that I'm using here, but the brain has neural networks. You know, there's groups of neurons that are more tightly integrated and less tightly integrated, and they actually the brain is. The magic of the brain is that some things are closely connected and other things are far apart. And so there's this really simplistic misconception that you want like all the neurons talking to all the neurons. No, that's bad. Like that's what happens when you come out as a baby and your brain now starts like pruning those connections, getting rid of the ones that are not necessary. So our intelligence and our personality actually arises from some things being in closer relationship and some things being in farther relationship. So like Greystones wouldn't be what it was if it was in the heart of Dublin. You couldn't separate out a Greystones, right? It needs that distance. That's part of the magic that makes it what it is. So it's the same thing in the brain. And the issue with that setup is you can have pieces of your brain that are so disconnected that they're actually opposed to what you think you and your goals even are. They have totally different goals than yours, opposite goals to stop you from doing what you were going to do, because starting that company is very risky. You could lose your life savings, your reputation. What if it fails? You're going to be a laughingstock, right? So you have parts of yourself that are completely antagonistic toward what you think your stated goals are. And that's another way of being out of alignment.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Wow.
So how does that technical? So that describes that your brain. So you've almost got like you've boxed away the bits of your brain, the doubting bits, and you've kind of all in and feeding, which in technical speak. But is there anything else in that technical aspect that it's like? So for anyone from the manifesting type language, it's everything all in, burn the boats, as you said,
In total alignment.
Yeah, in total alignment. And then in the more technical speak, it's more like box the bits, the doubter aspects of your brain, put them in one box, lock them in the key, and throw the.
You've got 100 billion neurons, which are kind of like transistors in a computer processor, and so it's the difference between having 100 billion neurons working toward your goals and solving your problems, and 50 billion neurons working in this direction and 50 billion pulling in the opposite direction. That's what alignment would look like in that more technical kind of neuroscience.
Yeah, very well explained.
And then you go beyond that and say, well, I'm way more than 100 billion neurons. I'm actually 1 trillion cells, and there's actually a lot of wisdom and intelligence in the body. And what if my entire body, head to toe, is in alignment with the direction that I want to go? That's when it starts to look magical. That's when you start to look like Neo in the Matrix, when every cell is resonating and pulling in the same direction.
That's the Matrix, the movie. You know, and one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Geez, that's beautiful. And I'd love to lead now on to kind of the idea of money. Money is, you know, they'll say in relationships, there's two biggest things. Hang on, okay, you can go ahead.
No, just one little thing, and it's almost like a bridge to where you want to get to. So suddenly you're in your early 30s, you've reached financial freedom, you probably don't have to work for the rest of your days. Is there an existential crisis?
Yes.
Because as humans, like for millennium, this is based on an evolutional principle that, you know, we spend our days trying to find food, have shelter, and be secure. And suddenly you had enough finance or economic freedom that you could do all three of them.
So glad you brought
sit
this up.
in bed all day long.
Yeah.
So was that in itself a huge existential crisis? How do I find meaning? Suddenly you're actually living this nihilistic. You're actually experiencing.
My 100 billion neurons were mostly directed toward a goal that was now achieved.
It's a bit like the weight
What
of
do they
gold.
do now?
You know that documentary about Olympians, and it's like it's called The Weight of Gold. That
okay.
Suddenly they achieve gold, and they're suddenly like, what do I do now?
Right.
Just eat candy bars?
You get on the Wheaties box after that, and that's it. You get on the cereal box maybe, and what else can you do? Yeah. So I'm so glad you brought this up, because I remember the morning that I realized I could do pretty much anything I wanted to do. And I opened my eyes in the morning and I thought, do I get up and brush my teeth and go to a cafe and have a cup of coffee? Or do I buy a plane ticket to Tokyo? Because I also want to see Tokyo.
Boom!
Right? And 2 hours later, I was still lying in bed staring at the ceiling. I had neither gotten up and brushed my teeth and gone to the cafe, nor bought a plane ticket to Tokyo. That's what took to mind. Too many options.
I even noticed, like, and this is quite a different analogy, but we're planning a kitchen. We're building a new house, myself and my wife. like not me actually building, but we've a contractor, Jamie, and when he was saying you've every option, but he said you need to put down some things with which to push against.
Yeah,
if
exactly.
you don't put down a few solids, we're going to be at this all year.
Creativity and constraints is a thing.
So that in your case, you suddenly had a lack of boundaries.
Yeah.
So suddenly it was like,
most people wake up and they have
the
two options:
paralysis
go
of-
to work or I've got a day off. You woke up and I don't have to go to work anymore.
It's even a struggle to get to work. The kids need this and that, but they're like, they feel free just that they could get to work without having to get the kids brushed and on the bus and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so it really shrinks the possibility set, but it gets rid of a lot of that particular kind of existential crisis of too many options.
so how'd you deal with it?
You have to reinvent yourself again.
And how did you do it? How did you, rather than speaking to the third person, how did you address this? Did you go into depression?
I went back, a pseudo depression. Yeah, a kind of depression. I mean, if depression is a very just general term, yeah, I did go back into a depression.
Depressed, if you look at the etymology,
Yes,
you're
heavier,
depressed,
energy.
there's some kind
Deflated, the wind is out of your sails, you're in the doldrums, whatever.
Yeah,
right?
you lack purpose.
Yeah. So I had to figure out what the point of life looked like now. And this was a really beautiful experience, though, because I'm sitting there from my egoic self-perception saying, what is the point of my life now? Me. What do? I. And then I loved writing. I loved writing since I was a teenager. So I just started writing this essay, and it's called, I ended up titling it, What the Universe Was Doing Before You Got Here. And the question I posed to myself was, wait, instead of just asking myself, what do I do with myself now that I have options? What if I could see if the universe was doing something regardless of my presence here? Was it up to something before I arrived? Before I was here to have an existential crisis? Was the universe doing something? And I looked at the pattern of the universe so far as we know it, and you have something like the Big Bang and subatomic particles, and then they're getting together and forming elements, and the elements are getting together and forming molecules and gases and crystals, and then those are getting together and forming planets, and that's getting together and forming, life, single cell life, and then those are getting together and forming tissues, and those are getting together and forming organs and creatures and animals and cultures and cities and us. And so I really could perceive this trajectory that matter and energy was not content to stay in a simplistic form. It was continually reorganizing itself into what I called increasingly meaningful complexity, into increasingly complex shapes, but not just, and I'm a huge lover of language, and I mostly know just English, but I know a lot of English. And so I would look up words like complexity is a positive word or maybe a neutral word. Convolution means it's like a type of complexity that has a negative connotation to it. And there's other words like that. So we have a lot of words that actually describe the kind of complexity that we're dealing with. Elegance. Elegance means it's just got the right amount of complexity and simplicity and balance, right? So we have these words that actually describe this quality. And I could tell that the universe was going through a process of rearranging itself into increasingly elegant forms. And that was like a spiritual experience. I was actually in the habit, I forget this now, but I started to get into the habit of writing an essay every morning until I had an epiphany. And I would sit there by myself and think, and
This is at home.
That's
At
some
home.
pretty deep stuff. Like, this would be before breakfast, like.
Yeah, exactly.
How long would it take you? Like an hour, half hour?
It didn't matter at this point, And sometimes it would take all day, sometimes take multiple days, but I would go until I had an epiphany, and sometimes I would start crying because what I suddenly understood was so beautiful.
And this was all understanding through your own thought process.
Yeah.
There's an aspect to channel or something. I don't know what box to put it in, but it's like, it's not what most of us are going through. Like,
This is why I believe in past lives at this point, because
you're a very interesting man, you know that.
and I've been sort of like this since I was born, and that's why I'm just like, that's it. We show up with some imprints and memories of previous pursuits, I think, because this is a weird bent to have, yeah. And so I was addicted to epiphanies essentially.
And epiphanies meaning through the process of writing and thought, there was realizations about
The nature
life
of
and
reality.
The
nature
fundamental
of
nature of reality, which I told you guys when I met you
The
was
what guy?
really my drive. That's what I wanted to know. What is this? What is this and what am I?
Which is the greatest philosophical questions of any life on this planet, human life anyway.
Yeah, yeah. So then I decided that so once you realize that the universe is up to something, then the question is just, well, what if I got on board with what it's up to? And now you're in alignment, not just with yourself, but imagine you're in alignment now with a overarching cosmic force that you're inside of. And that's where things get even more matrixy, right?
That's amazing.
Yeah, right?
Wow.
Really
So how do
interesting
you-
that you're
how do you-
someone who speaks technology and isn't like
You speak
has the training
California
of a
really well
nerd,
too.
can also see this more philosophical, more spiritual language. They're
But
almost
just to be able
juxtaposed.
to describe it in like a in like a technical aspect.
Yeah. That's why somebody was like, oh, you should brand yourself as like a philosopher or something. I'm like, but I don't, if I say philosopher, people will think academic philosophy.
You're not
and,
rooted in pragmatism and practicality.
No, I'm my own first principles natural philosopher. I've studied some formal philosophy, and more than the opinions of other philosophers who are dead, systems like epistemology were very helpful and so on. But I began to notice that there were people in history who I would call lovers of truth and seekers of truth. And I remember I was walking through a used bookstore, probably around the time that I was going through this existential crisis of unlimited options. And I walk through this used bookstore and I see the spine of a book and it says, "The story of my experiments with truth."
Who's it by?
And I get chills in my spine and I reach and I grab the book and I pull it off the shelf and it's the autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi.
Wow.
Oh my God.
And I burst into tears because I knew I had found somebody who thought like I did. And I just absorbed that book and saw that he lived life as if he were a billionaire, even though he gave it all away and had nothing. He still felt and saw that he had the freedom to act, unlimited freedom to act. And what was he going to do with his life? He was going to help liberate people, help people to treat each other better, help raise the consciousness of humanity, help these British people, who had inhabited his land to live up to the own Christian principles that they were espousing. It was really truth, though. He said, everything you saw from my life was just my experiments with truth. And I knew I'd found somebody who...
One of his phrases was key with us starting the Happy Pear. We must be the change we want to see in the world. Like,
It's
that was one of the
famous,
huge things that just
And
has driven
one thing
me.
I'd love to dig in, you were uncovering what the universe wanted to do. And as you said, for anyone who wants to bring something into reality, try to get all your trillion cells in alignment and focused on one kind of goal. But when you can be in alignment with what the universe is trying to bring forth, well, now you've got a force to be reckoned
you could
with.
use the
right.
word God, you could use divinity, you could use
Whatever it might be.
language.
So
Whichever
how
one
do you
you-
determine, and what do you see as the universe is trying to do now? Because it's like, that sounds great. Yeah, okay, I've got this idea which I want to create. If I can be in alignment with the universe, this is going to be a big wave. This is much more like
wind at my back rather than into the wind.
Yeah, downhill, downwind. Woohoo!
Now, you can still sabotage yourself even though the universe is waiting there for you to get in alignment with it. That's
Of
what
course.
most people are doing, for sure.
Yeah.
But to make this a little less lofty sounding for anybody listening who's thinking, oh, Jesus, I'm not, some
A philosopher.
addict of realization like this kid, but it's just like, let's just make this really bring it home. Every person listening, if they really just sat down for 5 minutes, they have a vision in their mind for one way to make the world more beautiful. Everybody does, if you really put it to them. And it could be that they know an elderly person in the neighborhood who doesn't have any company, and they know a family who could use somebody watching a child or being in the same room with their kids play or something. And their mind has noticed this disparity and knows that if it introduced those people, it could create the universe could become more beautiful. This elderly person sitting at home would have the purpose and the joy of being with this child, and this child would have the experience of having an older person around. So that may be the little bit of alignment that you and the universe have. But if you act on that that builds your psyche, that builds your soul, that builds your substance.
Momentum. You're almost being positively reinforced.
Exactly.
So it's almost like acting on these impulses that, these impulses that are possibly connected to a much greater universe, and
that can seem a little like
almost
why,
like intuition.
Why would I do that? We're a little afraid,
right?
Even if you look at the intuition, like our internal teacher.
Well, and it could be the most significant thing you do all year. It could change the course of your life. You might do that and then realize, oh my God, that's a business I could start or something, right? And I'm not saying that's a great business per se, but you take that step, and it is the little test that the universe has given you. It's saying, you want to feel what it's like to be in alignment with me? Start here. It's not saying start with a multi-million-dollar company. Yeah.
That's
I like that.
Class, in alignment with me. And you said there, so a lot of people sabotage themselves.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? And that might lead me on to something else. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, if any part of the self is out of alignment, it's going to be sabotaging you, because it's trying to prevent this outcome that it thinks is dangerous.
And we talked about this, which is probably a really concrete example, is a lot of people kind of have the idea that they want to be really wealthy. We have the idea, I want to have loads of money to buy a house.
Kind of cultural narrative that's
like
being sold.
In lots of research, they'll ask people, what are the most important things in life? What are your most important things for your life? And number one is typically to become wealthy, and number two is to become famous, and then after that it kind of trickles down. So
yeah, most people don't want either.
Yeah, I know, but
really.
could you expand on why? And this was a beautiful conversation we had earlier.
Because deep down in their subconscious mind, neither of those things feels like a safe course of action. When it comes down to it, if they were to suddenly have $10 million, would their friends still like them? Would their friends like them for the right reasons? Would their friends treat them badly, just like they had, they'll remember the 100 negative things that their friends and family have said about rich people since they were a child. And that's all in there somewhere. And there's an identity, a self-identity that says, wow, if I became a wealthy person, I wouldn't actually fit in with my friends and my family. And that'd be terrible.
So from an evolutionary perspective, like tribe and community and family are so endemic to being part of the human experience and existence and staying alive.
Yeah.
So subconsciously, we quite possibly,
we don't
many
want
of
to
us
step outside of the tribe or above the tribe. We don't
might risk our chance of survival. They mightn't like us. They mightn't support us. It's like, oh my God, my family don't like me.
And there's also there's a self-image that we all have about ourselves. Like if we were to hypnotize you and have you imagine who you are and what you look like and what your life looks like, there is a self-image. There's a representation you have of yourself. And if your reality around you stops matching your self-image, you will work subconsciously to bring your reality back into alignment with your self-image. And most people, that self-image is not of a wealthy person or a famous person.
So how does someone listening kind of go, okay, that sounds like it makes a lot of sense. How do we go about changing this self-image, this deep-rooted, because they're deep, they're really
Can I give one
deep.
example of that self-image?
Yeah.
I remember it was a friend always said it. He had a friend who, like, in terms of good looks, he was like a 5 out of 10. But he always was with girls who were 9 out of 10.
Of course.
Because he saw himself much better, and he typically
Totally.
go for girls that saw themselves as a 5. And that was how, obviously this is removing any personality or any other bits, but this was his little simplified way. And I'm just wondering, is that
that's an example
of it? Okay.
Yeah, there's a person who
Crude
has
example.
confidence, and their self-image is of a confident person, and they've got, for whatever reason, they believe they've got the goods to give this girl a nice time. And somebody else who looks 10 times better, they don't feel that way about themselves. And they might know that they look better, but they think, oh my God, if I was alone with this person, I wouldn't even know what to do or whatever, right?
or what to say.
Yeah. And so it is that the image we have of ourselves. Now, sometimes I feel like the whole name of the game about life is really being honest with ourselves. And then, of course, being honest with other people. But we are rarely honest with ourselves even. And so if a person were really, really introspective and really honest with themselves, they could say, how do I really feel about money? Let's just imagine that I had $10 million. Like, what do I actually feel? And their stomach starts grumbling immediately, and they start having images of, whatever, being robbed or canceled or who knows what, right? You'll start, if you really introspect, you'll start seeing the negative imagery of what's going to happen. So people are just too busy and distracted and aren't practiced at that kind of.
distract themselves or subconsciously.
Well, subconsciously not. Like, you know,
They don't want
like you're
it.
saying,
They say they want it, but they don't want it. That's the
And they
reality.
also don't know how. This is what bothers me the most about humans at this point in society, is how bad we are at debugging our own code.
and that's only someone who's a technical computer person could describe it, like a debugging our own code.
Yeah.
It's an amazing way of looking at it. That we
It's
all
like,
we
ultimately,
all have
in
an
woo-woo
operating.
speak, you're saying get ourselves into alignment.
Yeah.
But essentially, like, we all have our operating systems, our means of seeing the world and interacting with the world, and it's very much out of alignment, as you've described it, for many of us.
And my wife, who's a clinical psychologist, would say we all have trauma, which is getting in the way of pursuing.
They're potentially
our truth.
bugs.
Absolutely.
Or debugging our own code is another language.
That's
Yeah.
I've never heard it described like that. What a title for a book! Debugging our own code.
I don't know if it was necessary.
I don't know if it's a bestseller. I don't know if it's right about masses, but it's a really interesting way of looking at things. Wow, what a
To summarize that little nugget, in essence, you're saying the more one is in alignment in terms of finance, like what they actually want and what their actual subconscious and what their actual self-worth is, the more you're going to achieve what it is that you really want. Because you might say you want to be a millionaire, but your actions, your beliefs are totally different.
Yeah. There's a huge part of your mind that you're not privy to that really doesn't and actively will stop you.
And the only way you're going to get privy to that is to actually look inside. And
To look inside. And you can do that through journaling, through introspecting, even things like hypnosis. And there's various kind of psychological modalities that work with being in an altered state. And they make... it's kind of like putting the computer into safe mode. If you remember back in those days, you'd have to debug the computer and you have to put it in safe mode because it was hard to debug it while it was running all those programs. So you reboot into safe mode and now you have a very simplistic version of the operating system there and you can find the bugs more easily. And that's any psychological modality kind of fits into like either just talk therapy, we're working at this level, or it puts you into an altered state of consciousness that's kind of like a safe mode to do some.
And what about
deeper digging.
psychedelics? Is that something that safe mode and you can go into the...
That's safe mode and beyond. That's like that can even set up a whole nother awareness to then like look at yourself from a perspective that you might have really struggled to see before. That's a very common experience. Therapeutic dissociation, you might call that. Yeah.
Incredible. I'm enjoying this so much. There is, however, many other things we need to talk about.
Yeah.
So
one thing
why is this guy wearing a hat? This is soil.
Exactly. So just to give the context. So we've delved deep into the entrepreneurial thing and the kind of bringing things into reality in life.
I'm just texting my wife to say I'm going to be late, if that's okay.
Okay,
Sorry,
yeah, cool. I'll probably need to do the same because this is amazing. I'm enjoying this so much. Like, it really is incredible. We need to kind of go. So the chronological aspect of this is fascinating because we're up to now your mid 30s, your early 30s. You're financially completely free and you don't have a job. And you're having you're journaling, you're looking at the nature of reality, and you're kind of going, okay, well, I've managed to create this business which gave me financial freedom. It helped the world to some degree, but how can I align myself more with the cosmos, the universe, whatever way, and create? And it's ultimately into creator good. And since then, you've got a company, you've got more into the charity aspect or into the humanitarian aspect. Service.
Well, in that book of Gandhi's, I got to see this servant life being lived. There's one more thing I want to say about money because it's just fascinating.
Yeah, and I love this. I'd love to delve more into
which
this.
is, you will meet wealthy people who don't care about money. They had some other goal, like they wanted to make. Like I don't know that James Cameron cares about money. He loves making movies, though. You see, he loves having the resources to produce.
But that's the thing that our society doesn't celebrate. It's like the money is the outcome of doing something beautiful that you love.
Right.
And that is of value.
But the important thing about these kind of people is they at least don't have negativity toward the money.
No.
So that was just a little clarification for your listeners. It's not that they all get whipped up in a frenzy of wanting money and diving through pools of money, but you at least need to not be opposed to it and antagonistic toward it. And if you can get to that point, and then you can find what you love in life and what is your passion, you may find you become wealthy, making doilies. It doesn't matter.
You're still
so obviously you said about debugging your own code.
Yeah.
You've got to first realize that you have a bug. as in you've got a way of looking at money which is subconsciously negative, and try to somehow unravel that and probably.
And I'll give you an example. Like whenever an acquirer came around to buy my company and the deal fell through, I would feel a huge sense of relief.
Wow.
And one day I caught it. And I go, whoa, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Like most people would be thrilled to have more money come in, right? So I noticed that. And I said, wait a minute, this means that I am afraid of selling the company. What is it? You know?
I'm afraid of the freedom.
I'm afraid of, honestly, at this point, I still, thought wealthy people were all douchebags. I didn't want to be a wealthy person. I was convincing myself at this point that I still wasn't a wealthy person. I had the freedom to do whatever I wanted, but I didn't identify as a wealthy person.
And you were taking a large salary at that point.
Yeah. Exactly. So I was already happy. I was already content. I was in equilibrium.
And you were already reasonably wealthy compared to most.
And how did you debug your own code then? Because you caught this one little, seed and somehow managed to dig it out. Like,
yeah. Thankfully, I had a good executive coach at the time who helped me figure out a lot of this stuff. A wonderful woman named Brandy Gilmore. She pointed out a lot of this stuff to me.
Executive coach, therapist, different clothes on a similar creature, and possibly different languages.
Well, it's really nice to have somebody in your life whose job it is to point out your blind spots. So
it could be mentor, executive coach,
but
therapist.
It could be a friend possibly, or is it better having someone, a third party person that isn't involved in your life?
No, if you have good friends, you have good friends like that. But if your friend is also broken, not successful and whatever, then maybe they're not going to be able to spot it, right? They've got the same bug, right? But each person has to decide what outside observer is right for them. But that's another 100 billion neurons looking in at your life, and that's very powerful. And again, if you look at a computer or a motherboard, you've got tons of processors on that motherboard. You don't just have one CPU. You've got chips watching chips, monitoring the output of different chips. It's a distributed network kind of thing, right? So it's great to have
more powerful than we even understand. Okay, so the idea, like, that makes a lot of sense because, as you said, when you're debugging the code of a computer, you will most likely need help with it. You may not know how to do it yourself. So
literally, you could bring in another programmer and they could spot something that you've been overlooking. I remember I had this program, I couldn't debug it, or a friend he could not debug this program. And I looked at this damn thing and it said something, plus equals, and it was supposed to say equals plus, and it wasn't throwing an error, it was just doing the wrong thing. It was doing what it was being told, and just like his eyes were glazing over. He couldn't see that, so you bring that in, and I bet you all have a community. I bet you notice patterns in other people's lives around you that they don't notice about themselves.
Well, even as an identical twin, so we're genetically, 90, we're genetically as close as you get, really. Yeah. But it's so much easier for me to judge Stephen's life, which I'm quite good at. Yeah. And Stephen finds very frustrating.
Yeah.
But it's so much easier to see faults in, because he's not me and he can see so much faults in me. It's so much easier.
Yeah.
Like I can't, David.
Obviously it's harder for you,
one of you sees faults and the other one's just projecting. But like I had a friend who was in a very difficult, almost suicidal state, and he's calling me up and he's just like, I know self-love is the answer, but I can't break through. And I was like, yeah, that's right. Like self-love is the answer in some weird way, but it's not the right answer for him right now. And suddenly I had it. I said, forget self-love. You don't even have self-like. You don't even treat yourself with the decency that you treat strangers on the street. I see you be so kind to a waiter who just did like an adequate job at a restaurant. You don't even treat yourself with the same level of kindness. And he exploded into tears. That was the realization he needed at that moment. He wasn't going to see it because he was
a nice one.
Fixated on this self-love thing, which was 10 steps up on the ladder of where he needed to be. He needed to stop punching himself in the face and just be decent toward himself, right? And in that moment, I could spot that, and he couldn't, right? So to the extent we can do that for each other, that's real community, yeah.
But it's particularly on this thing, because we live in such a money-centric world, capitalism, money is very important for life, and what you've described is a really interesting thing, debugging the code of one's how one relates with money, because when you look at relationships, the two biggest issues which crop up in relationships is money and sex.
Yeah.
You know, and money is a big one, and certainly, you know, I can see in myself, my own upbringing, I definitely could do it looking at my code and going, my relationship with money. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's listened to this podcast who's going, yeah, actually, this makes sense. Like there's definitely issues of frugality or scarcity or how to let this flow. Because as you said, like Nikola Tesla, who was, you know, was an incredible physicist and inventor and all sorts of things. And he described the universe as a universe of resonance, that if we are open ourselves up. Now, this is quite metaphysical and California speak or woo-woo speak, but it's at a physical level, as a physics level, it's also very correct that we are energetic creatures that are tuning forks. And if we tune our frequency to a certain frequency, the same way you ring a chord A on a guitar, A will be resonated back if an instrument is nearby. So well, you know what you're reminding me of?
Remember that essay I told you about, what the universe was doing before you got here? And I remember now when I broke down into tears. And it was the last paragraph that I wrote as I was thinking about the universe creating complexity and meaningful complexity. And then I said, wait a minute, what is the single most complex creation ever to arise in the universe? As far as we know.
Human.
It's you and me.
Possibly.
As far as we know.
The egoic human would definitely come up with that
anyway.
But
wait, don't brush past the because this could save somebody's life out there if they realized how special they were, right? You don't want to jump to the humility of like, oh, but there might be something smarter than me out there. Like, just rest at this point. And I said in the known universe, right? And so it's like the single most concentrated point of complexity that we know of as far as raw number of interconnections is sitting on top of your shoulders and mine right now in a universe that, as far as we can tell, is mostly empty space and mostly dead. That's weird in a beautiful way. Like that alone, if you really grasp that the universe is mostly empty space and the most concentrated point of complexity is you and I, it's just dotted with these little points of concentrated complexity, and there's nothing more complex. A dolphin's not more complex. A whale, an elephant, they're all beautiful creatures, but like pound for pound, you've got the most complexity. So you are, in the known universe, the paragon of creation, the apotheosis of creation.
Nice words.
And so we are, what made me think of it is, we are the most advanced supercomputer in the known universe right now. And we have just barely begun to learn how to program ourselves.
Okay, that gives a wonderful segue. And we're going to touch on it briefly before we talk about your hat. AI. AI is something can we give just 5 minutes on AI? Just 5 minutes.
Last time we talked about AI in a podcast, it was like 45 minutes later, and we went, and it was such a twist to the tale.
Okay, I'm going to
tell your wives to come on down in 3 hours.
Chapter 2. Let's do a chapter 2 and do AI instead.
AI could answer that for
Okay, yes.
Yeah, there's no way.
Because I know you're really
into
that.
It's one of my favorite subjects.
And last time you said to me, I've just got one question. That was like,
no.
Okay.
We'll save it for a sequel.
Let's come back here tomorrow and do more of this. I'm having so much fun. I had to get my journal now to take notes. So that's about as high a compliment as I can give. It was like, this stuff coming out of your mouth is gold.
The happy pair, the world's best pesto and great conversations about AI together at last.
Boom, let's do it. And chocolate. We got some really good chocolate.
Beans
bar chocolate here.
Okay, so to go where you were trying to go 20 minutes ago. So I've got this, I'm emerging from this existential crisis. I realize that the universe is creating beautiful and meaningful complexity. And I've studied the life of Gandhi and service and all this. And then so what was profound about Gandhi's life is he went looking for very simple problems around him. Like he was vegetarian and he was ruled by people who didn't believe that vegetarians were a thing. Like literally most of the English at the time thought you needed meat, not just meat. They thought you needed beer. They thought you needed beer and meat to be healthy, right?
Wow.
And he says to them, literally, he would go give these polite speeches and say, vegetarians are possible. They are real. And in fact, you are now inhabiting a country of several 100 million vegetarians. And he would say it like not taking the piss or anything. He would just say it in a very helpful way, trying to educate them, trying to educate the occupiers.
How
of
would
his
it be
country.
received?
not well, not well. But
well, that hasn't changed in like since he died. Like, if you say you're a vegan now, or
trending a bit more,
trending a little more. Yeah.
I think, like 4 people showed up to the Vegetarian Society meeting, when he would hold it, 80 years ago or whatever. But anyways, I just noticed how he just looked for very practical, any opportunity to make the world a better place. And so when I went looking for the next problem to solve, I noticed that a lot of my family members were sick with chronic diseases and just unhealthfulness, right? And so I didn't know what that was about. And I thought, well, gee, instead of going and trying to solve global problems, I've got problems at home here, so let's try to go get to the bottom of those. And I kid you not, that's when I realized that like food is a thing, and the quality of food is a thing, and the food system is a thing. And so I just, in the same way that I felt really cheated by religion growing up and filling my head with things that weren't true, I now felt like everything I'd been taught about the food system was a lie, and everything I'd been fed was mostly a lie. It wasn't real food. In a sense, philosophically, there's not much truth in those food products, right? They're pretending to be food.
The nutrients were poor.
Yeah. And so I just started growing my own food. I said, I've got to start from first principles. I'm going to plant my own seeds. I'm going to grow food.
Where were you living at the time?
North Carolina. And so I started in the windowsills of my apartment because I really didn't know if a seed would actually grow. And then in December, in the middle of winter, I had cucumbers and tomatoes in my apartment, and that was profound. That was important. And then I thought, well, this is incredible. Let's go do this outside where it's supposed to be. And then I thought, well, I don't need a lot of space. And so I started a community garden. And this is where I'm like, I joke about being an introvert, but like I started the community garden by myself, and I just built it by myself. Maybe one friend came over, one day. And then when it was finally done, I opened it up.
And did you buy land, or did you?
This was in an apartment complex where I was living. I just got permission to do it.
Wow.
I had permission to do it. And I didn't, before that, I'd wanted to do a compost because I realized that I was going to eat the plants, but I knew so little about the food system. I literally said to myself, what is it that plants eat? I eat the plants. What do plants eat? And I didn't know. And I was like, well, I think they eat fertilizer. And so I went down to the hardware store, where they sell lawnmowers and weed whackers and things. And there was this aisle of fertilizer and weed killer. I think it's all in the same aisle. And it smelled awful. Plastic and I feel my life force like being damaged as I walk down this aisle. And I thought, that can't be what powers plants. That doesn't make any sense. The arrows don't match up, It's like, so I eventually
So you didn't buy it?
I didn't buy it. And I went asking around, and then somebody said, oh, the plants will eat compost, and, or you should put compost
and
on
light
it.
and water.
And light and water. I knew that part.
Okay.
But I think I gotten to the point where, some plants that were doing well stopped doing well. They'd yielded fruit, and then they were no longer being nourished. They had plenty of water and plenty of sun, right? So this is where I was like, what's going on? Oh, they need more than that. They need these nutrients, right? And so that's when I discovered that at least half of what I was putting in the trash every day didn't belong there. It belonged back in the food system. And I just really couldn't believe what I was reading, that if you did this, beautiful recipe correctly, the microbes would wake up and it would turn it all back into this dark black soil. And so I did that. And I didn't have enough content at first. I just was a single guy. And
So what you're talking about really is composting for anyone who's listening.
Yeah, composting. And so I went around door to door to my neighbors in this apartment complex, and I said, I need your help. I have heard that I can make this compost stuff out of food scraps. I've seen pictures on the internet. I don't know if it works, but I need a lot more volume than I have. Would you help me out and start bringing your food scraps to this compost bin?
Could work for an introvert, calling around to the neighbors.
Oh, yeah, and it took a lot.
Is this like 10 years ago now?
It's not as bad as asking people for $300,000 to track their buses, though, right? So it's burned off a bit at this point. But still took some doing to go around and ask those people. And they all said, sure, I'm happy to help. And within a couple of weeks, we were filling this thing up together, and they were coming out and dropping off their banana peels, and they were asking me questions, what about my paper towels and the tea bags and the coffee filters? And I'm like, yeah, I think pretty much anything that was once alive, and the coffee filter is made of like wood pulp, and that used to be a tree. So I think you can put that in there. And I just got obsessed with it. I got obsessed with the process.
Everything in alignment.
In alignment.
Everything in
threw
alignment.
myself at it. As like this was the new computer. This was like the compost processing unit, right? The CPU.
And now, when you're talking about in alignment with the universe as well, this is like, the nature of life is turning life back into life. Like,
so I would say this was aligned at that level as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's different if you're trying to get in alignment with, I don't know, Lamborghinis and bikini models or something. Like maybe that's your dharma. I don't know, but this was where the universe wanted me to go, I think. So lo and behold, within a few months, I got my neighbors together and we scraped away the leaves and stuff and pulled out this jet black, nourishing soil. And I think some of us cried because we just realized, we were all adults at this point, that we had been throwing the earth away when the earth could heal itself and power itself and give back to us if we just were just decent toward it, right? And did this thing. And we also felt a bit gypped because we'd all had college educations as well, and nobody had ever told us about this. You don't learn that in computer science. You don't, so it's like, it seemed like basic operating information about being a human hadn't been taught to us. And so this really beautiful scene unfolded of doing the compost together. I'd get a bottle of wine in a boombox on a Friday night and I'd put it out there, and people come by and we'd shovel and turn this thing. And then the community garden was right there. And I really watched this beautiful, holistic, quasi-spiritual, slice of heaven on earth emerging from this little patch of scraggly grass that, used to have nothing going on there except for, dogs.
Sounds like a little Eden is forming.
A little Eden was forming, yeah. And then each person, I watched how much transformation continued on in their life. They started eating more organic because they said, wait a minute, if I'm putting the banana peel in there and that's going to go in our garden and there's chemicals on the banana peel, then maybe I shouldn't be buying the ones with chemicals anymore. It literally, people say behavior change is difficult, but what I discovered was that
once it's integrated and they can actually see the causality of their actions.
With feedback loops, the mind updates easily.
Jeez.
You go back into technological speak.
Amazing.
Personal change via technology speak.
Yeah. And what's funny is when I went to university, like what I actually wanted to study was cybernetics, which wasn't really a thing being taught there, but that was all about feedback loops and systems. And it was kind of like, the brain is a giant, a concentrated nervous system. And so this notion of feedback loops of information, whether organically or digitally, there was something that gripped me about them. So yeah, the feedback loops were happening.
One thing that was fascinating that a friend Charles Dowding always said, like, to have a true, and this was just, I thought it was fascinating. He had a local box scheme, and he used to, give people, they'd get their veg and they give back the compost. And he said, if it was to be truly closed loop, they should be giving me their feces and their urine too.
Oh, of course.
And I just thought that was like,
no, I think
because that's just nutrients. Like that's just
so. You have to have a gateway experience for people.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's starting with the banana peels and the coffee grounds.
I'm going way out there, but
within a few months of doing that, they come to that realization themselves. And that's what's beautiful. So that's to really cut to the chase. Years later, when I was looking for another way to have an impact on the planet, and I had gone on and from the community garden and started an urban farm and said, let this community garden is so beautiful. Let's scale this up and do a full acre. And let's not do it in my little apartment complex. Let's do it in the middle of the city center where people will have to see it. They'll have to ask the question of where does food come from, because they'll be driving by it on their way to work and saying, oh my God, what is that? It's a bunch of kale growing? Tomatoes? I wanted them to see it. And that worked out well. And so then later on, when I was looking for a way to really bring about a lot of change planet-wide, I couldn't get out of my head the amount of transformation I had seen as the neighbors made that new living soil together out of their food scraps. The change in their identity. We've talked a lot about identity. But up to that moment, all any of us had done was make garbage. Up to that moment, all any of us had done was take a toll on the planet and consume the planet. This was the first time we had ever done something where we had aided the planet in its regeneration. And the moment we saw that happen, it gave us a new identity for ourselves. And so I realized that the most important thing I could do with humanity where it is right now and all the challenges it's facing would be if I could scale this experience of making soil together in community because I knew it completed so many feedback loops and it gave people a new identity, which is what we need going forward.
Wow, and I love the fact that it's togetherness, because there's something about working side by side in the land or on the land together that is really healing, cathartic, cleansing,
humanizing,
connecting, hugely connecting. The only place where the same amount of microbial biodiversity is the human microbiome is the soil.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's something really.
But what you're saying there is what I think what made it so catalytic the first time round in your community block is that people are putting their food scraps in, it's turning into soil, and then there's the garden right beside it.
They're seeing the whole thing.
So you're seeing the whole thing, which is a very, the feedback loop there is really, really quick.
Completing another feedback loop over there. And then they're eating it and they're going, that tastes way better than anything I've ever bought. That's completing another feedback loop, right? There's no substitute for these. You can't really documentary your way toward these experiences. And that's why the more that we can scale these kind of experiences.
Because now that leads on to, so your current project, it's a charity, it's called Make Soil.
Yeah.
And essentially how I understand it is it's a global movement where you've got a map and people can look at their local town, wherever they are, and start their own composting community where people come in and they put their compost in their garden. Like Harold literally started one yesterday up in Delgany and Greystones. If anyone wants to dump compost, Harold's collecting compost and making soil, and together people make soil together.
That's right.
And is part of that people can start growing together. So
we call people like Harold the soil maker. So that came to me as to help facilitate the new identity, it's nice to have a new title. And so soil maker is pretty cool. And so we call them the soil maker. And that humble little compost bin becomes a soil site, because now it's a place where the community is coming. And we have this software platform, which is kind of my forte. I'm kind of doing the same thing for compost bins that I did for the public transit systems. Essentially, you have this decentralized or public infrastructure that's really underutilized. And so in the same way that we had buses going up and down the street with nobody on them except the bus driver, that didn't make any sense because nobody knew where it was. We have compost bins that have one person using them when there could be 5 neighbors using them. And so we're finding every person on earth who's composting. And if that's you listening, then please pay attention right now, because this is for you. You become a soil maker. You join the platform as a soil site, and we begin matching just the right number of neighbors to participate for your capacity.
What's the sweet spot?
Well, it depends on each person's technique, and they get to set that themselves. Yeah.
Nice. And just for anyone listening, a lot of municipal, and this is from our own experience of having a food business for almost 20 years, a lot of municipal, that's like town composting facilities, typically aren't composting it so they can come back as soil. Typically, they're actually incinerating it and bringing back kind of like potash.
That's to your understanding.
That's to my limited understanding. But
it differs wherever you go, but those... I want to say that those programs are better than nothing.
Absolutely.
But in some cases, depending on how many trucks they had to build and how the shape of the routes and how many miles per gallon those things get.
Often isn't it food waste put through into, like, say, landfill gives off X amount extra methane.
You want to keep it out of landfill. And that's what's so beautiful about this act of composting together, of making soil together, is immediately you're doing a good thing for the planet by keeping it out of the landfill.
Yeah.
You're putting nutrients back into the food system. Not, if that goes to the landfill, it's not just the greenhouse gas off-gassing. Those nutrients that the food system depends on are taken out of circulation for like 1,000 years. Who knows when we'll harvest nutrients out of a landfill for the food system, like if ever, right? So you need to stop those nutrients hemorrhaging into landfills, which is happening in most places worldwide right now. Most cities don't have any kind of curbside pickup scheme.
Like, in essence, this movement is connecting people to soil.
It really is.
And understanding with soil comes food, because all nutrients in food come from soil. And ultimately, like, even it was Dan, I can't remember his name.
Saladino.
No, Dan, who wrote a book called The Third Plate, and he spoke about research. Dan Barber, who spoke about research in the Midwest where economic prosperity and educational levels were linked to topsoil quality. Wow. As topsoil became eroded, educational level, economic prosperity were almost directly correlated. And even there was research in the Midwest of the States, and that was like 3 years ago, showing that as topsoil eroded, economic prosperity significantly declined due to loss of harvest and crops.
Even more subtly, mental health. You reach into and grab a handful of living soil that's microbially rich, and I've felt this sensation, and other people have reported it as well. I think all those microbes are communicating to your skin that, look, the earth is alive. Like, you live in a living system, not just some place where there's raw materials to harvest, like you learn in economics or something, right? But you're part of a giant living system. And this microbial world is the same one that birthed and evolved you over millions of years, you know? And so I think even just touching the living soil does powerful things to the mind.
We went up to a friend recently who he's an amazing guy. We had him on the podcast. They call him the death metal
Lord.
Oh, yeah,
Lord.
I heard about this guy.
A really interesting guy. He's rewilding. He's got the second biggest landowner in Ireland.
Lord.
He's rewilding nearly half of it. And he talks about the journey where he's rewilding about 600 acres.
Yeah.
And he's been doing it the last 10 years. And before that was just farmland. It was cattle, agricultural cattle land. So really monoculture, cattle out there. And there wasn't massive biodiversity. The amount of animals and species were completely declining year on year. And over the last 10 years, it's like the amount, I haven't seen, there's an amazing benefit of biodiversity. And we were up there only last week, and the amount of bugs, the amount of butterflies, the amount of life just booming and blossoming from there. And I was kind of chatting to him and saying, like, over the last decade, have you found your own connection, your own intelligence, your own intuition, whatever it might be, whatever word you choose to input there, has kind of changed? Obviously, it's going to happen over time, but because he's now in this, living in this environment, which is so much more microbes, life, diversity, and he is a product of that environment, is his own experience changing. And like, what I'm saying might sound stupid, but it's, most of us live in urban environments. We don't live in gardens. We don't spend that much time in nature. And the more we interact with the natural world, which is very diverse, the more our thinking and our feeling and our being and our alignment is and more
empathy.
Yeah.
So I have two phrases to describe what you're describing, and I call it ecosystem consciousness. So when you talk about the diversity that this gentleman is immersed in, he's immersed in a more robust ecosystem than was there before. And that ecosystem, as you observe it and live among it, it begins to repattern the brain, and I believe actually change the brain structure into something that's more resonant with ecosystems. So the part of the reason we're doing so much damage to the planet is because the lack of immersion in ecosystems is leading to a simplistic brain structure. So you've got like a 4-bit resolution on a 64-bit situation, right? You don't have the resolving capacity in the brain to understand how to take care of the planet well. Whereas when you get that ecosystem consciousness, it becomes intuitive. You can feel when you're out of alignment. You can feel that this is doing damage to the planet. You can feel that plastic is not going to go back into the system. You have that. The ecosystem consciousness is like a new kind of software that gets loaded into your brain. And then you just start wanting to do the right thing. You don't need climate change numbers to scare you or anything like that. You just want to increasingly harmonize with that environment. And you have more earth empathy.
You're such an amazing, unique individual, because you've got this incredible binary computer technical background, and then you've got this absolute like earth conscious love, which is like, they're almost like two different worlds.
I know.
And it's such a unique perspective to hear you talk, because you can speak to the, to the spiritual kind of more, empathetic, connected type person to someone who's much more scientific, and they're two different languages, yet you can articulate them. It's very unique.
It's why I think I'm here. It's the world in the civilization. I really appreciate that compliment, but almost everything about human civilization is technological, and almost everything technological is out of harmony with natural ecosystems right now. And so we need this kind of unifying intelligence that brings and harmonizes these forces, and we're just at the very beginning of it.
And ultimately, one of the greatest intelligence on this planet is soil. And the biodiversity of it, and its ability just to function and synthesize and turn death into life.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
So in terms of Make Soil, for anyone listening who's inspired and goes, yes, I'm into it. I was sold a materialistic dream. You've been there, you've done that. Soil sounds fascinating. I'm in. How do I learn more? How do I get involved?
Yeah,
What's your
exactly.
pitch to get people psyched about it?
Anybody out there who knows how to compost, we need you as a soil maker.
And even someone who's pursuing materialistic gain and the possibly the false.
You're running out of words now.
Okay, sorry.
He's running out of words.
I was gonna go. I'll stop.
And anybody out there who doesn't know how to compost or make soil, but who feels when they're putting the food scraps into the trash that they just don't belong there, they can feel that that's not in alignment with how the planet works, just please sign up at Make Soil. It's a nonprofit. What we're going to do is we're going to either match you with a soil site immediately, a neighbor who's willing to accept those food scraps, and you're going to love it, or just sign up, and then the moment that a soil site pops up on the map, the system will start matching you. The code will go to work matching you. And so that's an example of technology harmonizing human civilization with the biosphere. And that we need more technology like that. We need more technology in service to the biosphere. And that this is one example. So part of what's important about this project and participating is that as people participate in this, they'll see opportunities like this in other industries, in their jobs, in their fields, because we need more of that kind of harmonizing energy in every industry right now.
You're a gift. You're an absolute gift. You really,
Josh,
really are.
Loved that. Great conversation.
I am
so
in
many
awe.
great stories.
I am in absolute
Fabulous.
awe. I really am. Thank you.
So it's makesoil.org.
Makesoil.org, yeah.
Okay, brilliant.
Charity.
Yeah.
You know, if you're inspired, go check it out because it's really,
thank
you know,
you. And I've been inspired by you too. This is an incredible thing. Your regenerative, benevolent mini kingdom over here. It's been I've been well nourished by it, and some of the happiest people I've ever met, to be honest.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
And stay tuned for 2. Can we,
yes! AI coming soon. Woo! Well, let's see. More of this. Philosophy. You're a philosopher. Like you really are. You're unique.
That's kind of our sweet spot.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
Love that.